All right, welcome everyone. Today it's a pleasure to have Dave Held, who's faculty at CMU. Dave and I actually used to sit across each other at Berkeley in Sutharja Hall, and I met Dave back in 2016 maybe. And since then he's gone on to do a bunch of amazing work in robotic manipulation, in computer vision, across. I really love his work on deformable object manipulation and 3D vision. And so he's won the Career Award, a Google Faculty Award, and spent some time at Amazon. But his work is some of the most interesting, combining perception and manipulation. So please take it over.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for coming. Today I'd like to tell you about my work on precise and generalizable robot manipulation. So like many people working in robotics, my goal is to bring robots into diverse settings, like the home, robots that can cook, do flexible manufacturing, agriculture, all sorts of different tasks. And if you look in social media, you might have seen some videos like this of robots doing fancy acrobatics. And you can actually buy one of these robots. And here's a video of someone unboxing this robot, and it's able to stand up on its own and do cool things. So we also can see videos online of robots doing various manipulation tasks like cooking. And you can buy one of these robots as well. But there's no unboxing video of a robot that comes out of the box and starts cooking in your home. So why is that? Where is my robot chef? So in order to answer that question, let's think about how many robot learning methods are trained today. There's obviously different approaches, but one of the popular approaches out there today is to take some large-scale, real-world robot data set and use that to train some giant neural network policy that's been pre-trained on some internet-scale data. So maybe fine-tuning a vision language model to output robot actions. And let's see how well these methods work. So here's an example that I think illustrates something important. This is from Google DeepMind from 2023, so a couple years ago. And the task here is to move the Coke can to Taylor Swift. And you can see the robot picks up the Coke can, moves it kind of towards Taylor Swift, and then drops it on the table. And so what's really great about this is that the robot has some general knowledge about the world in some very important things, like who is Taylor Swift. I love that this robot knows who Taylor Swift is. She's great. But in terms of the manipulation side, the robot actually was not able to really do the task super well. It kind of dropped the Coke can on the table. So the real problem is that robots are not actually precise enough. So on the axis of generality, we've actually done a great job. We now have foundation models that understand lots of things about the world, including who Taylor Swift is. But on the other axis of precision, specialist task-specific models still significantly outperform these generalists. So our goal is to try to get models that are both precise and general. And how do we achieve that? So let's look at some of the insights we can get from each of these different kinds of models. So from the foundation models, we have learned that we need large-scale data sets, expressive policies, and limited assumptions, and that leads to generality. But what insights can we take away from specialist models that help them to achieve their precision, and how can we combine these insights? So one paper that I particularly like from Dieter's group from a few years ago is contact grasp net. So it's a really great grasping method. We use it all the time in our group when we need to pick up something. Contact grasp net takes as input an observation of the scene and outputs a bunch of predicted gripper poses for different points in the scene. And then they use basically motion planning to move the robot to actually execute one of these grasps. And so you can kind of think about this as somewhat like a hierarchy. At the high level, contact grasp net does scene-level reasoning to output grasp poses or gripper poses, which is basically telling the method where should the gripper go next to achieve this task. And then you have what could be called a low-level policy that tells the robot how to actually move to achieve the task. In this case, it's motion planning and inverse kinematics. So a question I've been thinking about is how can we take this motion hierarchy that has been developed for grasping and has been very successful and apply it to a more general set of tasks. And that's what I've been exploring in my research, and that's what's led me to be able to achieve the different kind of things that that you can see on this slide of robots manipulating deformable and articulated objects, doing some tasks that require very high precision. And so I'm going to tell you today about a few of these projects. So I'll start off with this project here, which is called Articubot. It was presented in RSS last year. And the goal is to train a single policy that can manipulate all of these unseen articulate objects. And this project was led by my student Yufei and Ziyu, who was interning with us. So this project started with, OK, we want to manipulate articulated objects, so we need some kind of data set of manipulating articulated objects. And we're going to generate that data set in simulation. So in simulation, we can do grasp sampling to find a good grasp. We do motion planning to reach the grasp. And then we use privileged kinematic information about the object to generate a demonstration of opening the object. And here's what some of these demonstrations look like. So you can just run this approach over and over, throw out whatever trajectories don't achieve the task, keep the good ones. That's your data set. And because we're in simulation, we can randomize over different object types, different spatial configurations, and different camera angles as much as we want. And we end up with a data set that has over 40,000 trajectories. Great. OK, so the next step is to train this, use this data set to train a giant policy. And so we first tried training a end-to-end policy that maps point cloud observations to robot actions. And it gets decent performance on the training objects. But then when we try to evaluate it on unseen objects, we see the performance is not very good. So the x-axis here is how many training objects we've trained on. In total, we end up with 40,000 trajectories that came from these 200 some odd objects in different poses, configurations, things like that. And the y-axis is the performance on 10 unseen objects. And so even with this large amount of simulated data, we're still not able to achieve very good performance. So in looking at these plots, it doesn't look like they're increasing very quickly. You would need much more data to make this work, even beyond what we were able to produce in simulation. So we tried lots of different things to get this to work. And what ended up actually working is something that we call hierarchical imitation learning. So given a demonstration, we divide this demonstration up into a set of frames, some of which we select as keyframes. And then we have a high-level policy that is going to output, try to predict the keyframes, and the low-level policy that will predict the robot motion between those keyframes. So in more detail, we're going to put in the observation into some high-level policy that outputs some high-level information. We then have a low-level policy that's conditioned on this high-level information, as well as the original observation, and output the low-level robot actions. The high-level information in our case is the gripper pose at the keyframes, which we represent as 4 points on the gripper that we're going to try to predict. So one thing that is important to note here is that this high-level information is just kind of an extra guidance for the low-level. But the low-level also receives the original observation as input. So it can ignore that extra guidance if it wants. The high level is basically telling the robot where to go, and the low level is telling the robot how to move to get there. And I'll note that both the high and low level are trained with regular behavior cloning loss. So the policy is not actually being trained to reach the high level prediction. It's just trained to imitate the expert, but it gets this extra guidance from the high level to help it figure out what is the right action that it should take. And so, yeah, I guess some more architectural details for anyone who's interested in that. The way our architecture works is we have something that we developed called a weighted displacement model. So for every point in the point cloud, we're going to predict a residual, so like a delta XYZ of where should the gripper go at the next subgoal relative to that point. And this creates kind of a translation invariance because as you move the object around, then these residuals should stay the same because you want to predict where the gripper is basically relative to this object. And then we also predict a weight for each point. We combine these with a weighted average, and that gives us our prediction of the subgoal end-effector pose. Our low level is just a giant transformer diffusion policy with this extra input, which is the predicted end-effector subgoal. And here you can see the performance. So compared to the end-to-end policies, our method has a huge boost in performance. So basically, it went from sort of non-working to actually working, essentially, through the use of this hierarchical policy. So we're able to train a single policy in simulation and then deploy it on 3 different robot embodiments. Franca X-arm with a default gripper and X-arm with a fast Yumi gripper. And here you can see the results. So lab A is our lab. Lab B is another lab in South Korea. And at the bottom are different lounges, offices, and kitchens around our building. So you can see it's able to work, zero shot in all of these different settings. Another nice thing about our particular architecture is that we can visualize the weights. So we didn't design it particularly to be interpretable, but it ends up having a nice interpretation because we're taking a weighted average over these points with learned weights that are learned just end to end. But you can see that, say, prior to grasping, the method learns to put a high weight on points close to the handle where the grasp will happen. After the grasp occurs, then the next subgoal is sort of in the air in the opening pose. And so the robot, the weights become kind of more diffuse at that point, which also makes sense. So to kind of summarize this first direction, we did large-scale demonstration generation in simulation. We then trained a hierarchical policy on that and zero-shot transferred that to the real world. So this was kind of our first exploration into showing the benefits of hierarchical policy. And we are following this up with some ongoing work that I'm really excited to share with you, in which we extend this to even more tasks. So here we're exploring tasks not just opening, but also closing, grasping, and placing objects also on top of or inside containers. And we think these are sort of 4 fundamental manipulation tasks that really any robot should be able to do these 4 things very well. So we generate, again, a massive data set in simulation with over 180,000 trajectories and train a big multitask hierarchical policy on this data. This is work, again, led by my student Yufei, who I should also mention is graduating and looking for postdoc or industry positions. So feel free to reach out to him if you have any interesting leads. And Chen Yuan, who was interning with us at the time. And so in this case, we have a kind of different architecture that we use. So in this, so the way we approach this is, suppose we have some point cloud observation of the scene, and some of the tasks we have here are actually fairly multimodal. So maybe here, in some cases, you might want to grasp this object, but in other cases, you might want to grasp the other object. If you just do a weighted average like before, then you might end up averaging these 2 examples together and get a grasp that's in between, which would not be correct. So we use what we call a dense Gaussian mixture model, which is essentially for every point in the point cloud, we predict a weight for that point and also a residual of where the gripper should be from that point. And we treat that residual as the mean of a per point Gaussian. So if there's 1,000 points in your point cloud, you have 1,000 Gaussians with 1,000 weights, and we combine them all into a giant dense GMM, and we train this with just a standard negative log likelihood loss. This ended up actually working better than 3D diffusion policies that we compared against. And the other nice thing is that it simultaneously outputs dense predictions over the entire scene. as opposed to if you had to run diffusion many times to get multiple predictions. So yeah, and so now we can get multimodal subgoal predictions over different objects or possible group replacements in the scene. And here you can see a visualization of our method in the real world. Again, zero-shot transferred from sim. So the top row is showing the robot doing the opening tasks. Then, okay. Anyway, you can just imagine robots like, I guess, finishing the tasks being shown here. It ends up being able to grasp objects and place them and things like that. So we compare this to, yes?
Good. How does the robot know which object to pick up?
Right. So so the grasping is actually kind of the way you would standardly evaluate a grasping method like contact grasp net. It's just the goal is to pick up any object and do kind of like like contact. Most grasping methods are kind of evaluated to like clear out all the objects in a bin kind of scenario. So so yeah, there's no kind of like language steering to say pick up the banana or whatever. There's sort of the only we do have language that says is our task to open, close, grasp, or pick in place, but yeah, we don't say which object to pick up. Yeah. Yes.
So if you're generating data by like finding the handle, looking for the direction of articulation, and then doing like a primitive, right? Like the kinematic primitive that you have, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Could you not just do that in real?
Well, so there's a couple of things. So first of all, we're using privileged information to generate that data. So we know in simulation the kinematics of the objects. So what you would have to do is estimate kinematic parameters or something like that. Also, our data.
Kinematic parameters, you mean which direction the hinge is going or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. What is the location of the hinge relative to the handle? So you need to know like that radius and whether it's a revolute joint or a prismatic joint, things like that. Also, our data generation procedure actually doesn't have a super high success rate. I forget what it is, but let's just imagine it's, say, 25%. That means that you run it 4 times to generate one demonstration. You keep the successful demonstration and throw out the failures, but that's fine because it's just a data generation procedure. Yeah.
Do you have any insights, like if there's like a low success rate on data generations, is there like a sort of cluster of like successful initial conditions that you're restricted to in your data generation successes, or is it just like kind of random?
Yeah, I think so. It seems to me more random, but it's a valid question. A lot of it is if I just maybe I'll just jump back to that slide. So for grasping, you need to I guess we're not. I guess we weren't really aware of sort of a really good grasping method out there for handles because I guess most state-of-the-art grasping methods are designed for kind of lifting objects. For handles, the goal is to have a good grasp to be able to open something. And so we just kind of sample some antipodal grasps and then keep the ones that work as part of the demonstration. So yeah, that's I guess where a lot of the bad demonstrations come from. Yeah. Yes.
I might have missed this detail, but how frequently does the high-level policy provide a subgoal to the low-level policy?
Yeah, every time step. Yeah, they're both high and low level are outputting subgoals every time step. Yeah. Great question. Cool. So jumping back. Cool. Okay, yeah, so that, we finally saw the video of that. So we compare this to a couple of different types of methods. First, we compare it to other multitask methods. We train Maniflow on our same data set and compare that. And we also compare it to Pi05 that was trained on Droid. And here you can see the performance of those methods in comparison to our approach. We get significantly better performance than these other multitask methods on opening and grasping, with the caveat that we can't do as many things, obviously, as Pi05 can do, but we can do at least these 4 basic manipulation tasks pretty well. So we significantly outperform prior generalists at these fundamental manipulation tasks. And then we also compare the state-of-the-art task-specific specialists. So for example, for the task of opening, we compare to our first work, Articubot, that is only trained and designed for opening. We also compare to Content GraspNet, which is still actually today one of the state-of-the-art grasping methods. And we get almost the same performance. So we match the performance of the state-of-the-art specialist models that are trained and designed to do only one thing, but we're able to do 4 different tasks. We can also take the data that we have and analyze the scaling laws for both our approach and some of the end-to-end approaches. So we compare here to, so our approach is in blue at the top, and we compare to DB3 and Maniflow, train on the same data. And the x-axis here is the number of trajectories with different orders of magnitude. So training on 1,800 trajectories, 18,000, and 180,000 trajectories. This is showing the performance for all tasks. And on the right, we see the performance on opening storage furniture, which turns out to be one of the hardest tasks. And so you can kind of see sort of the scaling laws for the end-to-end methods. And there is some slight increase as you go up 2 orders of magnitude, but it looks like it would need 8 or so more orders of magnitude to reach the performance of our method. So yeah, I guess with enough data, it would eventually learn, but it would kind of require like many lifetimes of data to get there. So another cool thing is that besides just being able to do these 4 fundamental tasks, we can take this model and fine-tune it on other tasks. And so here we just have 33 demonstrations, and we fine-tune it on this laundry folding task, and it learns to do it pretty well. We also compare to other pre-training approaches. So this is diffusion policy just trained from scratch. We fine-tune Pi05, and then we fine-tune our approach on 3 mimic gen tasks. And we can see that for fine-tuning, our method gives significantly better performance. So to kind of wrap up these 2 projects together, we now have these 4 basic manipulation tasks. We train our hierarchical policy on them and zero-shot transfer that to the real world. And we show that we match the performance of prior state-of-the-art specialists at these tasks while outperforming prior generalists at these tasks. And we can also efficiently fine-tune this model on new tasks. I'll pause here in case there are any questions before I move on to the next part. OK, great. So that was the first project on hierarchical policies for large-scale training. The next project that I'd like to tell you about is this question of how can we transfer behavior from a human to a robot. And this was just accepted and will be presented at RSS this coming year. And it was led by my student, Shriram, who will be staying at CMU for his PhD. So many people have worked on learning from demonstrations before in different kinds of ways. And there's different ways that you can collect demonstration data. One of the popular ways to do it is with robot teleoperation. However, teleoperation data is relatively expensive to collect. You need to give humans the teleoperation device, train them how to use it, and have them go out and kind of manually collect data for each task. So it has the advantage of, the disadvantage of being more expensive to collect, but the advantage is that teleoperation data is actually robot data. So at test time and training time, the data looks the same. It's just data from the robot with robot sensors. Another data source would be human demonstrations. So can we just watch third-person videos of people with no special hardware just doing tasks naturally in the world and somehow learn from that? So this third-person demonstration data is very cheap to collect. We just need to put cameras around our lab or download videos from YouTube maybe in the future, things like that. But there's two issues that make this type of data very hard to learn from. The first is that there is an embodiment gap. So the person is doing this task with a human hand, which is different from the robot hand. And so the person will do the task in maybe a slightly different way from how the robot would do it. The other issue is that we don't even exactly know what the human is doing. We can try to estimate the human hand pose, but our hand pose estimators are going to be noisy, especially during the contact-rich parts of manipulation that really matter. The hand is going to be occluded by objects in the scene. So those are some challenges. There's prior work on learning from human demonstrations. One of the most common approaches is action retargeting, where you create some mapping between the human hand and the robot hand. And this might work for very dexterous robot hands that have maybe somewhat similar morphology to a human hand, although even today, the most dexterous hands still are not exactly the same as a human hand. But it's even harder when you want the robot to actually do the task with a pinch gripper, which is completely different from a human hand. So usually for these learning from human demonstration papers, you kind of have the demonstrator pretend like they're a robot and move their hand like a claw, and to try to kind of minimize the morphology gap. And yeah, so there are the hand morphology differences kind of prevent these approaches from really working as well as we would like. So how do we get around this? Our insight is that even if the hand morphology itself is embodiment specific, so a human hand is different from a robot hand, the task subgoals are embodiment agnostic. So what I mean is, as a simple example, suppose a task is to pick up this mug and put it on the plate. You can imagine some subgoals like grasp the mug and put it on the table. And a human would usually perform each of these subgoals in the process of doing the task. A robot would probably perform similar subgoals. The robot would also need to grasp the mug and then place it on the table. So these task subgoals are somehow shared across different morphologies, and that's kind of the insight that we're going to leverage. So how do we leverage that insight? We're going to, again, use a hierarchical policy similar to before. In this case, everything is based on RGBD images instead of point clouds. So we take our images and extract some dyno features from them. We also know the 3D position of these, of the different patches in the image. We also encode the task that we want the robot to perform, pass it all to a big transformer, and then, like before, we are going to train a dense GMM. So in this case, we're using images. So a transformer typically divides up an image into patches, and each patch gets a token. And so we're going to predict for every patch where we think where the gripper should be at the end of the next subgoal relative to that patch. So it's somewhat similar to before. For every patch in the image, we're going to predict a residual delta XYZ and also a weight. And then we can create a big GMM over that with every a Gaussian for every patch, image patch, and train this like before with a negative log likelihood loss. And here you can see what those predictions look like. So you can see hopefully, yeah, okay, cool. So essentially what these arrows are showing is they're showing the residuals. So for every patch, it's showing where the gripper should be at the end of the next subgoal relative to that patch. And the opacity of the arrow is the weight. So yeah, essentially all the patches are learning to kind of generally point in the same direction of predicting some location of where it thinks the gripper should be at the end of the next subgoal. OK, so those are the predicted 3D subgoals that are predicted by the high-level policy. And then we're going to transform that to an end-effector heap map by just projecting these 3D subgoals into the 2D image. And then we can kind of color the image based on the distance between each pixel and the projected subgoal. So now we have the raw observations that we're going to input to our low-level policy. And we additionally have this other input that we're going to give it, which is the subgoal heap maps, which are basically predicted by the high level and fed to the low level. So the low level takes these different inputs and is going to output robot actions trained, again, with just regular imitation learning, but with this extra input. So to kind of wrap that all together, the high level is a transformer that's predicting for each patch these residuals and weights trained as a dense GMM and predicting the 3D subgoals. And the low level is conditioning on these subgoals and the observations to predict robot actions. So tying that back together with the original talk, the original motivation, the high level is going to be trained both on human and robot data, and the low level is trained only on robot data. And the reason for that is the insight that we talked about originally, which is that the task subgoals are embodiment agnostic. And so the high-level policy, which is predicting these task subgoals, can be trained both on human and robot data because it can learn from both morphologies some high-level information about the task. The low-level way of doing the task is sorry, it's got cut off. It's embodiment specific. So meaning that the way a human would do the task is slightly different from the way a robot would do the task. And so we train the low level only on robot data so that it learns the robot-specific way of doing the task, and the high level is trained on both human and robot data. So here are the different tasks that we evaluate on. So you can see some different kinds of manipulation tasks. And then we have some novel variations of the task that, so these tasks on the left, we have both human and robot data for, and the tasks on the right, we have only human data. So for example, we have robot data for putting a plate on a table, putting a mug in a bin, and then only human data for putting a mug on a table. Or we have a couple of folding tasks with human and robot data, and then folding these new things, we have only human data. And so we compare our method to a couple of baselines: diffusion policy trained only on robot data, mimic play, which is another way of doing human to robot, and our method, which gets significantly improved performance compared to these other approaches. And here you can see some visualizations of the robot doing these tasks. And here we're kind of visualizing the end-effector heap maps that are predicted by the high level that are guiding the low level of how to do the task. So to summarize this, our insight is that the task subgoals are embodiment agnostic. So they should be trained on, they can be trained on both human and robot data, whereas the morphology is embodiment specific. So that is trained on robot data only. I'll pause here again in case there are questions. Yeah.
How are you getting the subgoal labels?
Yeah, that's a great point. So in the projects that I've presented so far, we use either some heuristics or manual annotations. So, so like for articulated object manipulation, we just define one subgoal as grasping the handle, and then the other subgoal is when it's opened. For these, we have a person just manually annotate subgoals. There's lots of methods out there for trying to automatically detect subgoals. Like UVD is a good one. You can also ask a VLM to output subgoal, like to analyze a video and find which frames are subgoals. We have some ongoing work that's trying to do this in a more principled way. So sort of stay tuned for that. But yeah, that's currently, I guess, an open question. Yeah, great point. Any other questions before I go on? Yeah.
So even the tasks subgoals that we are getting from the human, like what are some classes of tasks that can be done with this, or that can still work on this robot? Because, for example, picking up the cup, you could. I noticed that the human hand is picking up the cup from the mouth, but you could pick it up by the handle. You could pick it up by like going in between the handle and just picking it up like this.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that transfers as well. So like maybe there's some additional burden on the human to like have this kind of hand.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I guess the question is, how similar does a human demonstration have to be to like how a robot would do it? And I guess there's sort of multiple ways to answer that. The first thing is just that the low level is trained only on robot data, and the subgoal is just an extra input. So if the subgoal is sort of somehow not useful for the low level policy, you could just ignore it. And so it doesn't kind of constrain the low level in any particular way. So if the human does it in a totally wacky way that the robot would never do, the robot, yeah, could just kind of ignore that. In the example that you gave, which is that you could grasp the object in different ways, well, I mean, I guess it sort of depends on what you want to happen, I guess. Like, for example, for certain tasks, you do want to grasp the object in a task-specific way. Like, if you want to, if your cup is full of water, you probably want to grasp it from the handle instead of like dipping your fingers inside. Or if you want to hang the mug on a mug rack, then probably you want to grasp it from the top so that the handle is kind of exposed to be able to hang it on the rack. So to some extent, like where you grasp the object is a functionally dependent, task-dependent way that maybe to some extent you do want to imitate, I guess. So yeah, there's multiple dimensions to this. Yeah.
Have you done any study on how sensitive it is to environmental changes? Say you change the lighting or the color of the cup changes or orientation. So how robust is the policy as such? Like you cache the information or you have to sort of retrain it all over again?
Yeah. So the question is about the robustness of the method to different environmental changes like lighting and things like that. So I guess I would say a few things. So first of all, I mean, any learned method is going to be limited by the data that it's trained on. One of the advantages that we have is that we're combining human and robot data. And so it's a lot easier to scale human data than robot data. So you could kind of imagine collecting human data with lots of environmental lighting and color variations and things like that. And the robot data might be collected in a more limited domain, but then the overall system is going to be much more robust because of the additional variations seen in the human data. Yeah. Cool. Great questions. Any other questions? All right. Excellent. So I will then move on to the last project, hopefully, which is about how to learn both generalizable and precise object placement. This was a project presented in ICRA 2026, led by Liu Xing and Eric Kai, who's sitting right here. So you can all tell him later how much you like the project, hopefully. Cool. So the project here is about how to learn to place objects in a way that's both generalizable and precise. So going back to this previous slide, what we want is a method that can do a task like mug hanging and to be able to hang all sorts of different mugs, or objects within a given category that might have different shapes and sizes and kind of handle variations, but still be precise enough to do the industrial insertion tasks that we see on the right. This is the NIST insertion board, and we're inserting this object that requires about 1 millimeter and 1 degree precision in order to properly successfully insert it into the socket. So we have a kind of series of papers on object placement, starting with taxpose and continuing to the method that I'm going to present here. So our approach has kind of changed over this series of papers, and the method that we kind of finally concluded this line of work with is this one, and the basic idea is we're going to do point cloud diffusion to predict the object placement. And so here in this example, we're trying to place a mug on a mug rack. Here's a scene with 4 different mug racks. And so we're going to diffuse, run a diffusion method that will predict where every point in the point cloud should go for this placement task, like the sort of subgoal prediction as a point cloud. And then we can feed that to a motion planner or policy that actually executes the task, picks up the mug, and places it in the target position. Now, there's a bunch of sort of tricks that we had to do to make this really work at the level of precision that we needed for the industrial insertion task. So I'll tell you about just a few of the main tricks here. So the first is that we actually want to separately diffuse the object translation and orientation. So you can kind of see here what we're doing is instead of diffusing the point cloud directly in the scene, we are diffusing the object shape in kind of a shape-centric reference frame, and then also separately diffusing where the centroid of this shape should go. That allows us to predict the shape very precisely, because the object shape in the shape-centric reference frame is kind of it's sort of a translation invariant thing. We've subtracted the translation from this prediction. Then we combine those to get the actual placement within the scene. Okay, so that's the first trick. Here's a second one, which is more interesting, I would say. So what we see here, what we're looking at here, is a scene of mug racks. So every orange point here is a point on a mug rack, and the pink points or purple points in the middle are the noisy Gaussian points that represent the mug in the beginning of the diffusion process. And we can watch what happens throughout the diffusion process as these points get diffused into their final location. So here we can see the points being, sorry, for some reason my videos are playing a little bit choppy, but the points kind of gradually move from the center of the scene over to the right where this mug rack is, and then they also move into the shape of a mug. So the thing to notice here is that there's sort of 2 scales of motion going on. One is a scene scale motion, which is that the points start in the center of the scene and then move over to the side where this particular mug rack is located. And the second is the object scale diffusion, which is that the points have to change their shape from a Gaussian blob into the shape of a mug. And these 2 scales make it very tricky to get this to happen very precisely, because with diffusion, there's sort of different parameters you can tune, such as the scaling of the scene relative to the initialization. And you can kind of tune these parameters either to be appropriate for the scene scale or for the object scale, but you can't really tune them to be appropriate for both at the same time. And so that's kind of the challenge. So how do we deal with that challenge? Well, we use a trick that is hopefully familiar to you all by now, which is we have a dense GMM. So basically, we train this dense Gaussian mixture model, which is going to predict for every point in the point cloud a weight and a residual, which says where should the centroid of this object be relative to that point. In this case, there's multiple mug racks, so it's going to predict all of the different like pegs or locations that the cup could go. And then the diffusion process only has to do a local refinement around that initialization. And that gets around this issue of having two different scales to worry about. So here you can see what that looks like for the industrial insertion task. We're going to diffuse the shape of the plug and its location relative to the socket. We combine these together and then do the actual insertion. So we test this out on these 3 different industrial insertion tasks, and we get performance that ranges from 80 to 100%. And these tasks require about 1 millimeter precision, or around 1 degree in terms of rotation. So it's precise enough to do that industrial insertion task, but also general enough to be able to handle these different tasks on this simulation benchmark from prior work, which involve placing mugs on of different shapes and sizes on a multi-peg rack, inserting books into a bookshelf, or placing stacking cans on top of other cans in a cabinet. We also didn't make any rigidity assumptions because we're just diffusing points in a point cloud, so we can also do non-rigid placement tasks. Like this is not, I guess, the most non-rigid task our lab has ever done, but we're kind of hanging like a deformable cloth on a cloth rack. We can compare it to some prior methods quantitatively as well. Here's our first attempt at solving this problem. These are error rates. This is a prior work that does SE3 diffusion, and then our method has only 3% errors. And so we can see we get significantly better performance than these prior approaches. And this was actually a little bit curious to us. This particular benchmark is a rigid object placement benchmark. And we were wondering, why is it that we outperform this prior work that does SE3 diffusion if we're just placing rigid objects? Shouldn't you just diffuse in SE3 space? And so we did some experiments to try to understand why this is. One experiment that we did was we said, well, what if you just have one mug that you're using for both training and for evaluation? In that case, actually, our approach versus SE3 diffusion performs about the same. But what happens when you train on a set of mugs and try to generalize to new mugs? In that case, there's actually a huge gap between SE3 diffusion and point cloud diffusion. And why is this? I think it's because SE3 diffusion is actually harder to generalize across object shapes. And to illustrate this point, I borrowed some slides that Anthony Simeonov gracefully shared with me. And you can sort of see this point, hopefully, through these examples. Let's suppose that your task is to grasp this picture, and you train on this picture and test on the same picture. In this case, you can pretty easily estimate the picture's pose, estimate the pose in the demonstration, and then on the test object, and use that to transfer the grasp. But suppose you want to generalize to a picture of a different height. Well, if you try to just transfer the grasp based on the picture's pose, you will not be able to grasp it correctly. You'll be sort of moving the gripper to the wrong location. So to do this task correctly, you would need to define kind of a task-specific pose reference frame, which is located on the lip of the cup. And now your grasp can actually transfer. But if you had a different task, like say to place the object on a surface, then your pose reference frame would need to be defined on the base of the object and in order to transfer it. So essentially, the issue is that for SE3 diffusion, you need to define a pose reference. And that pose reference actually matters a lot for what generalizes across different objects within a category, and needs to be defined in a task-specific way. So that's kind of a limitation. And in contrast, point cloud diffusion doesn't require any particular reference frame. You're just diffusing all the points in the point cloud and can therefore much more easily learn a task-specific kind of implicit notion of a reference frame that can generalize across different object shapes. Right. So to kind of summarize, we are able to learn a generalizable and precise object placement via point cloud diffusion using this method that starts with a global placement initialization and then does a local configuration refinement to estimate the exact object placement. Okay, so kind of wrapping things together, I started with this question of how do we obtain both precise and generalizable robot learning? And what we saw is that in the first set of projects, we have this hierarchy where we have a high-level policy that predicts grip or subgoals, and the low-level policy that conditions on that to output robot motions. And we showed how that leads to state-of-the-art performance in terms of articulated object manipulation, also performance on these 4 fundamental manipulation tasks that we can then fine-tune to do other tasks, and also human-to-robot transfer. And then in the last project, we have a different kind of hierarchy where we're predicting at the high-level object placement, and the low level is, again, outputting robot motions conditioned on that object placement. And that enables us to obtain both generalizable insertion across objects within a given category, as well as very precise insertion for these industrial insertion tasks. So the common theme here is a hierarchical motion policy where the high level is not kind of doing language reasoning or anything like that. It's predicting still sort of gripper actions just at this higher level of temporal abstraction than what the low level is predicting. Okay, so I guess just a quick slide about where are we going from here in our lab. So one thing I'm really interested in is how do we actually scale up robot learning? And we saw in this talk 2 ways of doing that. One is learning from large-scale simulation data, which I think many people here would agree is there's a lot more we can get out of simulation, and also learning from visual human demonstrations. So can we, I think we can also leverage much more the videos that we have showing humans doing lots of tasks and somehow extract that and transfer it to a robot. We showed one way of doing that, but there's much more that can be done there as well. I'm also really interested in methods that do combine learning and planning to do kind of long horizon manipulation tasks. In this example, we want to put a mug into a microwave. There's some mugs blocking the microwave, so you need to move them out of the way, open the microwave, and then put a mug inside. And so this requires some kind of long horizon reasoning and planning, or reasoning about tool use is another topic that I'm particularly interested in. So how can robots figure out what tools to use in what order in order to achieve some long horizon task? I'd like to acknowledge the terrific students who I've had the pleasure of working with throughout these different projects, without whom none of this would have been possible, as well as the generous sponsors of our group. And I will end here and take any remaining questions that you might have.
Yeah, 5 minutes for questions.
So, do you think if you were to train the high-level policy purely in simulation with domain randomization, do you think it would provide the same type of performance when coupled with a low-level policy that has been trained on the real robot?
Right, okay, so I guess your question is something like, how much data does the high level need relative to the low level for a given task? Is that right?
Can I avoid using real data for the high-level policy?
Right. Well, sorry, but is your question about the amount of data or about like sim-to-real gaps or something?
The question is about minimizing the use of real data for the high-level policy.
Right. Okay. Sure. So minimizing the use of real data for the high-level policy. Yeah, I mean, so I guess I would say a couple things. I think the answer is mostly yes, and I guess a couple of reasons for this. So I guess we talked about in the human-to-robot transfer project how the low level is the one that needs kind of the specific details of exactly how the robot should do the task. And the high level can be trained on both human and robot because it's just trying to learn some general high level knowledge. And so in that sense, even if there are sim to real gaps, you could, like, they don't matter as much for the high level, essentially, because it works even with a human to train the high level. So you could also train in sim. The other thing I'll note, though, which maybe is in contrast to this, is that if you're trying to, let's say, fine-tune on some downstream task, the low level is really the thing that transfers, essentially. Because the low level is kind of learning like a goal-reaching behavior with some task-specific deviations. So the low level is kind of learning, go to the high-level prediction, but go there in a task-specific way, in a way that depends on the particular task that's being performed. And so you only really need to retrain the high level and maybe just a little bit of fine-tune, like extra data for the low level. So I guess I don't know exactly how that fits into your question. It depends on what you're trying to transfer or why, but that's just another, yeah. Cool, yep.
One very quick question. If you have like non-predefined tasks, then how does low level be informed that this is not a free space motion where you can take any route for this goal reaching behavior, but you need to sustain a contact? Because these are all multitask low level policies, you will have low level demonstrations of free space motion as well as the in contact motion. So
yeah, so right, I mean, yeah, so that's like that comes up, for example, for opening a door. You can't just take a straight line from your handle to opening. You have to follow like a curved arc, right? So like how the low level moves is dependent on the task that's being performed. And so yeah, the low level, both the high and low level in all of our methods are conditioned on a language input that says what task is being performed. And so that language input kind of sort of tells the low level how it should move to, like that plus the demonstrations tell the low level how it should move to reach the particular goal. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
So I just want to clarify this for my understanding.
Sure.
So is the high level policy something like a dictionary that the low level policy sort of infers from and then understands, okay, this is a scenario, now I want to it's like its code book or manual or something?
I mean, I don't think of it like a dictionary. I mean, it's outputting actually a gripper pose in 6D. So a position and orientation of a gripper, basically. Yeah, so it's sort of outputting a continuous space prediction. Eric, do you have a question?
Yeah. Maybe more philosophical.
Yeah.
So I think we saw a couple of different subgoal representations in this talk. Like one was very object-centric, the other was more like gripper-centric or robot-centric.
Yeah.
Do you have a feeling of like, is there a correct choice for a subgoal representation, or is this like you gotta have to pick the right one for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's kind of my current feeling about that. Yeah, so we sort of started with like this the object-centric line of work, and I think that's very good for these high precision tasks where you really need to reason about where's the plug in relation to the socket and get that exactly right. And their object-centric reasoning, I think, is really the right way to go. But when we tried to run that method on like the droid data set, like crazy in the wild, cluttered scenes, it was hard to always segment out the right objects that we needed to care about for all of the different tasks. And in that case, a sort of more gripper-centric subgoal representation allowed us to generalize much better because it had fewer assumptions about object segmentation and object reasoning and object tracking and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about the trade-off. Yeah.
My last question, and you can start.
Okay, so when it comes to like a human execution, I think all of the dynamics in your slides are like the third perspective. But I think there's some like egocentric data and also like many data like human-centric. So how do you think like this centric of data?
Yeah, I mean, egocentric data can have some advantages in that it's, maybe a similar perspective to how a robot would see it if the robot has like cameras over its shoulder or something. And they're often wearing special glasses with like multiple cameras that can do really accurate hand tracking and things like that. I guess we're pushing more towards third-person cameras, just because I think that's even more scalable than egocentric cameras, because you don't require the human to wear special glasses or cameras. They can just perform the task naturally, and it's also something you can imagine learning from YouTube videos, which are all third-person, or mostly third-person perspectives. So yeah, we're kind of really pushing the limit on like what can you do with the most scalable data available, as opposed to requiring egocentric. Yeah, great question though.
Okay, since we're at time, let's thank Dave again.